It was a family road trip, kind of. A working vacation for Father. That's why Mother stayed behind. But Father thought the experience would be good for the children. They'd see some of America, this beautiful country. Father was a very important man, a doctor. As the family wagon bounced along the byways of late 1940s and 50s America, the children sang songs and played games like I Spy. Father whistled to himself as he navigated from a paper map spread out across the front seat. Tucked on the floorboard beside him was a small leather case. In it were the tools of his trade, a pair of ice picks.
To make out a small beam of light against the mirror.
Truly weird stuff.
On the evening of April 4th, 1950, some of the top surgeons in the United States gathered in Tuskegee, Alabama for the 28th annual meeting of the John A. Andrew Clinical Society. There was a speaker that night, a very well-known neurologist and consultant to both the VA and Walter Reed Hospital. His name was Dr. Walter Freeman. He was deeply critical of the VA's policy that a patient suffering from a mental health disorder had to have been under observation for 2 years before surgery might be considered as a treatment option. Dr. Freeman believed passionately that there was a simple surgical procedure that could be performed in the early stages of a mental health crisis, before what he called brain deterioration set in. A procedure that had the potential to free the patient forever from their mental torment. Not everyone at that meeting agreed with Dr. Freeman. There were some vocal skeptics in the room, which didn't stop Freeman from talking with great enthusiasm about his method of psychosurgery. He described the procedure as something easily learned that might take all of 10 minutes to perform. Then he passed around a pair of his surgical tools for his peers to handle and examine. The tools were ice picks, and Freeman's psychosurgery had another name, lobotomy. Dr. Walter Freeman didn't invent the lobotomy. That distinction and the Nobel Prize belongs to Portuguese physician Dr. Antonio Egas Moniz. Moniz performed the first lobotomy in 1935. The patient was a 63-year-old woman suffering from anxiety, depression, insomnia, paranoia, and hallucinations. Moniz didn't use an ice pick. That was Freeman's innovation. Moniz began by using absolute alcohol, which is also known as ethanol, to destroy the frontal lobes. Eventually, though, he created a needle-like tool with a retractable wire loop that sliced through the white matter fibers of the brain as it was swished around inside the patient's head. If you're thinking, what? What did I just hear? That is so crude and chaotic. Ding, ding, ding. You are absolutely correct. Dr. Moniz called the procedure a leucotomy. His first patient got the ethanol treatment, which is no less crude or chaotic when you think about it. I mean, after all, you'd probably rather we didn't drill a hole in your skull and drizzle in some ethanol. Now, to be fair, this Frankenstein-sounding treatment did appear to cause much of the patient's anxiety and depression to decline, though at the cost of her personality and ability to function. Still, what's the old saying? You can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs? Guess you couldn't win the 1949 Nobel Prize in Medicine without scrambling some brains. As barbaric as it sounds, it was actually, well, it was barbaric. That is the right word.
Freeman recommended a front-lobar lobotomy in order to change my behavior. I was 12 years old.
That's Howard Dully, speaking in the documentary Howard's Story. He was one of Freeman's youngest patients at age 12, and He's one of the last survivors of the transorbital lobotomy. His adult life has been marked by struggle, poverty, depression, criminality.
I remember arriving there and being checked in, just normally in a bed. I did not know that Freeman had written instructions that I was not to be told what I was really there for. I do remember that they gave me electroshock. Freeman stated that he probably gave me one more than I need. The memory comes back that I think I was horrified when I was getting the shocks because they were intense and I didn't understand them. And I just wanted them to stop. And then they did the ice pick procedure, less than 10 minutes. I did not know even after the lobotomy that I had a lobotomy. I think the anger, if there's any anger involved, is that they would have the nerve to play with someone's life like that. Psychologically, it definitely damages the person in their own mind because you are always different, you're always strange, you're not normal in your mind. I was different now. I was a freak.
The human brain has always been a mystery to us. Even now, with all the extraordinary imaging technology at our disposal, we can map the brain, but there's so many unknowns. Setting aside the whole mystery of human consciousness, and we really don't know how any of that works, the physical brain itself holds secrets we've yet to unlock. Even the ancients believed, or at least sensed, that the very essence of a person appeared to reside in the relatively cramped confines of the human skull. We know this because we found archaeological evidence of primitive brain surgery dating back thousands of years, about 7,000 years in at least one case. Ancient human skeletal remains have been unearthed with the skulls showing clear signs of cuts on the bone, as well as holes drilled by some long-deceased surgical pioneer. The procedure is called trepanation, and whether it was a desperate last-ditch attempt to relieve pain or treat an injury, or perhaps release what was feared to be a demon, trepanation means drilling or cutting away a portion of bone from the skull. Here's an example. The bodies of two brothers were found in a 3,500-year-old tomb in Israel. Their skeletons showed significant developmental anomalies, as well as lesions on the bones that suggest leprosy. One of the brothers' skulls had clearly not fused together properly after infancy and also featured a missing section of frontal bone. That missing piece was found in the tomb alongside the body. The tomb was also filled with the kinds of artifacts that tell us that these two brothers came from a family of means, which probably explains why they received so much medical intervention and lived as long as they did. The rich having access to better medical care is clearly not a modern phenomenon. One more thing before we climb out of this dusty old tomb and return to our own time. Trepanation is still a valid medical procedure today. Removing a section of bone or drilling a small hole or two in the skull of a patient who has suffered a head injury is done now to help alleviate swelling or to drain a hematoma. Now, of course, today we do that to people in sterile operating rooms with the help of some sort of anesthesia. We have no idea what trepanation was like for the ancients. Were they awake? Were they tied down? Were they offered some kind of plant-derived sedative? And, more importantly, how many managed to even survive the operation? Never mind the risk of infection or inflicting permanent damage. Your first challenge was dodging the very real risk of bleeding out, which is why, even in the ancient world, brain surgery was not a first option, but a last resort. And it was still considered a last resort for psychiatric patients in the 20th century. Something to turn to only after all other treatments had failed. But Dr. Walter Freeman thought that lobotomy was not only misunderstood, but very much underutilized. Freeman saw lobotomy as a potential cure for not just mental illness, but for a whole list of other ailments too. Insomnia, postpartum depression, a nervous stomach, headaches, chronic pain, even disruptive behavior could all be addressed with the minimally invasive tap, tap, tap of an ice pick hammered into an eye socket. Okay, that was disrespectful. Please let me correct myself and use the proper medical terminology. Transorbital instead of eye socket. Orbitoclast instead of ice pick. Surgical mallet instead of hammer. But I stand by the whole minimally invasive part because Dr. Freeman's technique didn't require fancy things like operating rooms or anesthesiologists or even formal surgical training. Freeman himself hadn't trained as a surgeon. See, that was the beauty of it, according to Freeman, that so much suffering could be alleviated through such simple means. In the early days of his enthusiasm for fast brain surgery as an easy and life-altering treatment option, Dr. Freeman enlisted the expertise of a neurosurgeon named Dr. James Watts. The pair developed the Freeman-Watts standard lobotomy. It involved inserting a spatula-like tool and manipulating it to sever the nerve pathways in one lobe or lobes of the brain from those in other parts of the brain. Now, can we just pause here and marvel that anyone, anywhere, at any point in human history heard that and thought, yeah, that sounds like a very reasonable and very good idea. Sign me up. I mean, you do have to wonder how humanity has even made it this far. Anywho, on September 4th, 1936, Freeman and Watts gave their procedure its first real-world tryout. The patient was a woman named Alice Hood Hammett. She'd been diagnosed with agitated depression, but the operation almost didn't happen. Upon learning the night before that her head was to be shaved, Alice Hammett was like, well, that's a hard no. But Freeman persuaded her to go forward, promising to leave her hair intact. Still, the next morning, Alice continued to resist and was ultimately sedated and placed under general anesthesia. Today, that would mean a giant lawsuit. But back then, I guess it was, just a typical Friday in 1936. Here's how that surgery went down. 2 holes were drilled in Alice's skull, one on either side of the frontal lobes. They used a tool like the one invented by Dr. Moniz, a metal cylinder that extracted cores of white matter between the prefrontal cortex and the thalamus. Then, rotating the wire loop at the end of the tool, they scooped out more white matter, starting at a depth of 2 centimeters, then 3 centimeters, then 4 centimeters. There was one oopsie when they accidentally sliced through a blood vessel, but the patient's vital signs remained steady, and so they flushed out the surgical site with saline and stitched her scalp back up. When Alice Hammett woke up in post-op recovery, she described herself as feeling happy, so much so that she reportedly announced that she didn't even mind that Freeman had broken his promise and shaved her head. 6 days later, though, Alice Hammett began experiencing difficulties with language. She was agitated and disoriented, but the hospital sent her home anyway, and Freeman declared the operation a success. He also abandoned Dr. Moniz's term for the procedure, leucotomy, and instead dubbed it lobotomy. That accomplished 2 things. 1, it set what Freeman and Watts were doing apart from the work of the Nobel winner. And 2, it made it very clear that their process focused on the frontal lobes and involved both white and gray matter. Over the next 6 years, the pair performed more than 200 frontal lobotomies. The data they shared indicated that 63% of patients showed improvement, 23% showed no change whatsoever, and 14% experienced significant negative outcomes post-op and/or death. 14% seems like a lot when we're talking about catastrophic damage to the brain and/or death. But Dr. Freeman had an extremely powerful ally when it came to glossing over the bad news and highlighting the good: the media. In May 1941, the Saturday Evening Post published a rapturous profile of Freeman and Watts. And Freeman was a natural when it came to the media. He had a big theatrical personality. He adopted a kind of eccentric costume, a long goatee, round-rimmed spectacles, a dramatic wide-brimmed hat, a fancy walking stick, and around his neck, always, an engraved gold ring threaded onto a chain. Fun story about that ring. Early in his medical career, Freeman treated a young male patient who'd managed to get a metal ring stuck on his penis. Surprise! In case you thought dudes getting their junk trapped in whatever happens to be handy is some kind of new behavior. Anyway, Freeman managed to tug the ring off using a pair of forceps. When the patient asked for the ring back, Freeman lied and said that it was a medical artifact now and could not be returned. Freeman then had the ring repaired by a jeweler, engraved with his own family crest, and strung it on a chain, which he then wore pretty much every day. Weird. But then, Freeman was known to keep a little souvenir from each of his lobotomy patients. The media was Freeman's accomplice in spreading that good news about this near miraculous way of restoring peace and productivity to the troubled mind. The Saturday Evening Post hailed what Freeman and Watts were doing as nothing short of transforming a world full of hatred into one radiant with sunshine and kindness. A science reporter for the Washington Evening Star named Tom Henry wrote, quote,
"It seems unbelievable that uncontrollable sorrow could be changed into normal resignation with an auger and a knife."
In May 1946, a newspaper in Pittsburgh reported that Freeman and Watts had discovered a way to painlessly cure insanity. The story described one patient as a timid bookkeeper who, post-lobotomy, went on to become a successful, gregarious salesman and ultimately the president of his company. An article in the San Francisco Examiner in September 1948 told of a young woman who suddenly began experiencing bouts of muteness and despair. These episodes began when the woman became engaged to be married. Therapy had been ineffective. Electroshock treatment failed to deliver results. A 10-minute lobotomy? That did the trick. The woman's mother wrote her thanks to the surgeon saying, quote, "Thank God my daughter is about to be married. I am the happiest mother in the world." End quote. I'm just going to pop in here and say that, listen, if you are engaged and having doubts so extreme as to cause despair and muteness, perhaps what you need is not a lobotomy, but to call off the wedding. Sweet baby Jesus with an ice pick. What were people thinking back then? So, the media loved Dr. Freeman. Dr. Freeman loved the media. In fact, historians credit Freeman's media savvy for taking the lobotomy from an experimental option to something you might consider a quick and easy standard fix. Freeman arranged to have his lobotomy procedures photographed. He purchased a length of green felt, like the kind you see on pool tables, for use as a photographic backdrop. When you see those images all in stark black and white, the light from the camera's flash creating foreboding shadows, it's some mad scientist-looking stuff for real. But Freeman wasn't content with his first successes. He wanted to make the lobotomy procedure even more streamlined. Inspired by the work of Italian psychiatrist Amaro Fiamberti, who performed the very first transorbital lobotomy in 1937, Freeman began developing his own techniques and his own tools. This is his son Franklin, appearing in a 2013 PBS documentary called Lobotomy.
We didn't have a refrigerator, we had an ice box. The first ice picks came right out of our kitchen drawer, and they worked like a charm.
I guess we can be thankful he didn't reach for a whisk, too. Freeman's method, which called for penetrating the frontal lobes via the eye socket, followed by a lateral sweeping motion, essentially obliterated the frontal lobes of the brain. Freeman also dispensed with surgical anesthesia, using a portable electroshock machine instead. Gone too was any need for a surgical operating suite, as Freeman could now perform transorbital lobotomy as an outpatient procedure in an office setting. His partner, neurosurgeon Dr. James Watts, strongly objected to all of this. He was troubled by Freeman's disregard for the established standards of sterile medical protocols. Freeman often didn't even wash his hands before performing a lobotomy, rolling his eyes at all that germ crap, as he called it. Watts also acknowledged that the hospital at George Washington University had reprimanded Freeman for, performing surgery without being an actual surgeon. Even back then, hospitals were picky about that sort of thing. The conflict between Freeman and Watts came to a head in one utterly ghastly moment. Watts had informed Freeman that he would quit if Freeman did not cease performing lobotomy procedures in the office of their shared practice. And then came the day when Watts walked into the room to see a patient lying on the table, unconscious, with an orbitoclast lodged in his eye socket. Freeman glanced up and said, "Oh, good, you're here. Can you lend me a hand while I take a photograph?" That was it for Dr. Watts. He flatly refused. He told Freeman that he would lobby the hospital to block transorbital lobotomies from being performed and would not even entertain the idea of psychiatrists being trained to deliver the procedure. The partnership between the two men was over. And Freeman was now free to take his one-man portable lobotomy show on the road, and he did. The road trip that kicked off this episode, just one of many summers he spent traveling America, his children in tow, tools and electroshock machine packed and ready. And Freeman wasn't just delivering the procedure to patients. He was often doing it for an audience. He enjoyed the attention, was described as a natural showman. He apparently liked to elicit a shocked gasp or two from his audience by inserting 2 ice picks into each socket at a time. One report states that a patient died during one of these demonstrations when a sharp instrument slipped into the brain. Freeman's reaction? Indifference mostly. He immediately moved on to the next patient in line. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune reported that Dr. Freeman did 2 lobotomies there in March 1949, witnessed by a group of Twin Cities psychiatrists and neurosurgeons. In 1951, he performed 5 lobotomies as a training session for staff at Patton State Hospital in California. In January 1952, he demonstrated the procedure on 20 patients at Eastern State Hospital in Virginia. The clinical director of that institution, Dr. Eleanor Beamer Maxwell, reported that the only negative effects her team had observed were blackened and bruised areas around the eyes, which they described as looking like the patient had been kicked in the face by a mule. She boasted that of the 26 transorbital lobotomy patients under her care, 20 showed improvement and 8 had been able to go home. By this point, Freeman was advising lobotomy for anxiety, depression, grief, phobias, and even the pain of cancer. August 1952 brought a mass operation. Freeman performed lobotomies on 35 female patients at Spencer State Hospital in West Virginia. Newspaper The Spokesman Review reported that Freeman invited 150 relatives of patients there to attend a meeting on how to care for lobotomy patients once they were discharged and sent home. Freeman warned that the readjustment period post-lobotomy could last as long as a year, and that side effects might include overindulging in food, alcohol, sex, and spending. He advised families to offer
lots of loving and just enough punishment to add spice.
Let's just sit here for a second and take that in. By that point, Dr. Freeman had performed more than 1,100 transorbital lobotomies, many done under circumstances he called a demonstration project. Shockingly, his biggest failure, the one that history would remember best, didn't await him in the future. It was in his past, in the early days of Freeman's evangelizing for the lobotomy procedure. And had that early failure been as notorious when it happened as it later became, hundreds of people may have been spared the tragic outcomes of Freeman's quick and easy outpatient brain surgery. Her name was Rosemary Kennedy. She was born in 1918, the eldest daughter of Rose and Joseph Kennedy, sister to John, Robert, and Edward Kennedy, as in the Kennedy family. Rose Kennedy went into labor at home, and though her doctor was summoned, he was delayed. An outbreak of the Spanish flu epidemic at the time was straining medical resources to the breaking point. A nurse instructed Rose to keep her legs tightly together until the doctor could arrive. And apparently, the nurse also took the extreme step of forcing the baby's emerging head back up into the birth canal for 2 hours. When the doctor finally arrived, he pronounced the infant healthy, but those 2 hours of oxygen deprivation had taken a toll. Rosemary failed to hit developmental milestones, walking, grasping objects. As time went on, there were clear educational delays. The Kennedy parents, fixated on appearances, tried to conceal Rosemary's condition from family, friends, the public, and even Rosemary herself. They tried boarding school and a convent school, but as Rosemary matured, she became prone to aggression and violent outbursts. Were these episodes fits? Seizures? It's unclear, though you should know that Rosemary's letters, written with a childish, slanting penmanship, reveal a young girl trying desperately to fit in, to be good, to win the approval of her mother and father. Heartbreaking stuff. Yet in photographs taken in 1940, you can also see a radiant and beautiful Rosemary Kennedy, standing with her siblings Jean and John, laughing and carefree. In 1941, when Rosemary was 23 years old, her father, Joseph Kennedy, was weary of the outbursts, weary of Rosemary's repeated attempts to run away. He decided that this new lobotomy procedure might be just the thing to make his daughter more docile and manageable. The surgery at that point in time was considered a legitimate option in cases of mental illness, but Rosemary Kennedy's diagnosis was mental retardation, something lobotomy had not been used to treat. Still, the family proceeded. Whether or not Rosemary consented or even knew what was about to happen to her is a matter of debate. And so in the autumn of 1941 at George Washington University Hospital, Dr. Freeman and his then partner, Dr. James Watts, performed a prefrontal lobotomy on young Rosemary Kennedy. She was strapped to the operating table. She was wide awake. An anesthetic was used only in the areas where Freeman and Watts planned to drill 2 small holes in her skull. As the team worked, Rosemary recited poems and sang.
All of me, why not take all of me? Can't you see I'm no good without you?
Remember, these are the early days for Freeman and Watts, the days before ice picks and eye sockets. They inserted a small metal spatula into the holes drilled in Rosemary's skull and began sweeping and slicing the connections between her prefrontal cortex and the rest of her brain.
Take my lips, I want to lose them. Take my arms, I'll never use them.
And then abruptly, Rosemary fell silent.
Your goodbye.
Freeman and Watts realized they had gone too far. Whatever Joseph Kennedy's hopes had been for the procedure, the reality was devastating. Rosemary was no longer able to sing. She was no longer able to talk or walk. It took months of therapy before she could move on her own volition at all. One of her legs was permanently turned inward. She had only partial use of one arm. Her speech, when it finally returned, was garbled and incoherent. Her father had her moved to a psychiatric care clinic, and then to a residential facility in Jefferson, Wisconsin, where she remained until her death in 2005.
Your goodbye left me with eyes that cry. How can I go on, dear, without you?
Even Rosemary's siblings were kept in the dark about their sister's condition and her whereabouts, though decades later, her fate inspired their activism. Rosemary Kennedy's biographer, Kate Clifford Larson, said this in a 2015 interview with Boston's GBH News.
Her siblings were deeply shaken by her disappearance from the family. They were not told what happened to her. And once they became cognizant of what did happen to her, they became activists to make the world a better place for people with disabilities. Eunice went on to start the Special Olympics. Her brother Jack, as president, passed legislation that was important for people with disabilities and to get research and funding for that. And Senator Ted Kennedy, of course, was instrumental in getting the Americans with Disabilities Act passed. So the family carried on that legacy because of her.
And the rest, as they say, is history. You know now that as Freeman turned away from Rosemary Kennedy and exited that room, he went on to perform lobotomies on more than 4,000 patients. Some were children, at least one as young as 4 years old. You also know that Freeman made a show of it. On one particularly busy day, he single-handedly completed 20 lobotomies. His influence on psychiatry and on the doctors he trained in the procedure led to a dramatic increase in the use of lobotomy. Thanks in large part to Freeman's traveling brain surgery shows and his tireless courting of the media, more than 50,000 lobotomies were performed in the U.S. between 1949 and 1952. This despite a 14% mortality rate and very mixed results in terms of patient outcomes. In 1953, Freeman presented his findings at the 109th annual meeting of the American Psychiatric Association, held that year in Los Angeles. Freeman declared that in cases of patients who'd been in a mental health institution for less than 6 months, lobotomy returned 2 out of 3 of them to an effective life. After 6 months of institutionalization, the odds were 50-50 that lobotomy would prove effective. After more than a year, positive outcomes declined, though Freeman argued that it was really never too late for a lobotomy, and in fact, the sooner the better. Then he got even more specific and declared that 30% of lobotomy patients were able to hold down a job, 30% were able to be cared for at home, and only 20% could be characterized as, to use his words, flat failures. Reading from his own prepared paper, Freeman stated,
"It is undoubtedly true that no person is emotionally or mentally intact after a lobotomy. When one gives up anxiety and depression, one also relinquishes in some measure the emotional charges necessary for the ability to experience exultation and other joys of living."
You took the part that once was my heart.
It is well to remember that no person of creative ability has been restored to normal after lobotomy. All must pay a price for relief from anxiety.
Why not take all of me?
Lobotomy was increasingly falling out of favor as the 1950s and 1960s progressed. One state hospital in Virginia stopped allowing the procedure in 1955 and discontinued it altogether in 1962. Not on the grounds that it was barbaric or inhumane, but because it just hadn't proved all that effective. Dr. Freeman performed his last transorbital lobotomy in 1967. The patient was a woman named Helen Mortensen, and this was to be her 3rd lobotomy from Freeman. She died of a cerebral hemorrhage, joining at least 100 of Freeman's other patients in that fate. After Mortensen's death, Freeman was banned from ever doing the procedure again. No one associated with this grim and terrible chapter in medicine escaped unscathed. Dr. Moniz may have won the Nobel Prize for his experimental brain procedure, but that award is considered by many to be a stain on the legacy of the Nobel. Moniz himself suffered a tragic fate when, in 1949, a patient in the grip of a psychotic episode managed to lay hands on a gun. He fired 4 shots into Moniz, leaving him in a wheelchair until his death in 1955. He was 81. Freeman, ever on the road as a traveling lobotomist, knew his own share of tragedy. His wife Marjorie became an alcoholic. Freeman was not only an absent husband, he was also a prolific adulterer. Then in 1946, unthinkable tragedy struck when Freeman's 11-year-old son lost his footing and was swept over a waterfall at Yosemite National Park. Devastating as that loss must surely have been, Freeman seldom acknowledged it publicly. But 14 years later, when he first met then 11-year-old Howard Dully, the now grown-up lobotomy patient we heard from earlier in this episode, Freeman suggested to the boy that the two of them go hiking. Freeman died in 1972 of complications from cancer. His surviving children became fierce defenders of their father's legacy. 2, Paul and Walter Jr., followed in his footsteps and chose careers in psychiatry and neurobiology. The 3rd, Frank, retired from a career as a security guard and, as fate would have it, wound up living a short distance from Howard Dully. He confirmed that the original ice pick Freeman used came from the kitchen drawer of his childhood home, the same ice pick they'd used to punch new holes in their leather belts as they grew. This is exactly the kind of random detail that sticks with a person long after other, more important things are forgotten. With the luxury of hindsight, we can see how reckless and irresponsible so many of Freeman's decisions were. It seems impossible to us now that anyone ever thought that blindly and crudely poking around in the brain of a human being might yield anything but disaster. We can be appalled by Freeman himself, by his colleagues, by the casual indifference shown to so many of his patients. We can look at Joseph and Rose Kennedy and judge them harshly. They viewed their daughter Rosemary as defective, as a reason for shame, and in their devout Catholic belief system, perhaps even a judgment laid upon them by God. How might history be different if, after Freeman and Watts left 23-year-old Rosemary Kennedy in a vegetative state, the Kennedy parents had protested, made a fuss, blown the whistle on what Freeman and Watts were doing? Would hundreds, possibly thousands of other patients have been spared the consequences of Freeman's quick and easy outpatient brain surgery? But of course, that kind of thinking doesn't take you anywhere. There's no rewriting the past, no unscrambling the eggs, or in this case, the brains. You just have to hope and believe that the lessons we learn from mistakes of this gravity lead to better, safer, more ethical practices going forward. That's why we have to tell this story, why we can't let it slip into the past as though it were some freakish anomaly in the history of medicine, because it isn't. Without transparency and accountability, Freeman's patients suffered the loss of themselves for nothing. We owe them more and better than that. More and better than a game of woulda.
You took the best,
or coulda,
so why not take the rest?
or even shoulda.
Baby, take all of me.
Next time on True Weird Stuff, Brian Kohberger. He stands accused of brutally murdering 4 college students at Idaho State University. The trial will be next year, but right now Kohberger is at the center of 2 baffling cultural phenomenon. women in love with murderers, and the incel. Next time on True Weird Stuff.
And if you listen to us on Apple Podcasts, hit the plus button in the top right corner, and now it helps an independent podcast like ours to get discovered. And we really appreciate it if you subscribe, rate, and review True Weird Stuff.
Hit our website, trueweirdstuff.com, for show notes and photos and videos when we have it, and bonus content. Everything True Weird is waiting for you at trueweirdstuff.com.
And follow True Weird Stuff on Instagram and Twitter.
True Weird Stuff is a Now Media production. Our executive producer is Anthony Garcia. The show is written and hosted by me, Sherry Lynch, along with my deeply weird director, Max Sweeten. Our equally odd producer is Carrie Bowser. Additional production by the mysterious Stephen Call. Our digital witch and social media cult leader is Heather Furr. Original graphics by Kevin Nash. Original artworks by Olivia Axlin. True Weird original music composed and performed by Jack Griffin and Zane Nash. Copyright 2023 Now Media. All rights reserved. All wrongs remembered. Special thanks going out to Elizabeth Jordan for singing on this episode. That song, All of Me, was a big hit for Billie Holiday at around the time Rosemary Kennedy received that doomed and terrible lobotomy. Thank you, Elizabeth.
So, Sherry, this was an episode that we did before we started doing a little post-mortem on the episodes. And so both of us re-listened to it, and we had our own self-loathing about what our what our parts were per normal. However, there were so many things that I loved about the episode itself. Elizabeth's singing, which I had remembered was really good, and it was just astonishing, the girl that sang All of Me in this, and that was really pretty neat. But what I didn't anticipate was, as I was listening to this, I was driving. I had a little drive that I had to do. My stomach was so turning at the thought of what they were doing with an ice pick through the orbital socket of someone's face. I did not expect to get nauseous listening to what it was they were doing to these people.
Well, I think what happens is, I know this happens for me. By the time we finish working on an episode, like, we've been immersed in the story, and it's not that we're numb to it, but there's no shock value left for us. Like, the shock value for me, the shock value comes when, I first confront some of these facts and I'm putting them together into the story. But by the time the episode releases, like, you and I are like, oh yeah, they were just fishing around in people's heads with spatulas.
Ice
but
picks.
But we hadn't listened to that since it was released. And so the numbness wears off, I think. Because if you look, I was looking at early episodes of True Weird Stuff before we added the Post Mortem chat. And I was like, yeah, oh my God, that was horrific. Oh yeah, that was a rough story. If I went back and dove back into some of that, I'd probably, be all like nightmarish and weepy again. And I had someone, a friend actually, say to me, well, I mean, do you think it's good to, remind people of these things? I don't just think it's good. I think it's critically necessary to remind people of these things, because it's our collective social amnesia that takes us down these repeating roads. And what Dr. Freeman did with the transorbital lobotomy was so profoundly unethical and immoral. I mean, here's a guy that had no surgical training. Yeah, he was a neurologist, and you have to be real smart and you go to school for a real long time. But that doesn't make you a surgeon. That's a completely different skill set.
It's a neurosurgeon.
Yeah. And what they were doing, so I want you to imagine it. They just had you on the table, and they would put the ice pick or orbitoclast into your eye socket, and they would just kind of swish it around a little bit. You were not hooked up to something where they're watching your brain on a screen, like we have the technology we have now, right? None of that. It was It was a literally fumbling around in the dark and guessing. And I think maybe you'd have to be alive at that time to find a way to make that like, yeah, okay, that's what we're doing, right? I mean, didn't that just astonish you that they were just groping around so blindly in people's heads?
Yeah, I mean, here was what was kind of interesting. You said something else in there that surprised me, and that is some people died from cerebral hemorrhages. And you can certainly understand how that could have happened. You're blindly going in there, right? How do you know? Was nobody filing any kind of malpractice back then? Or is that something that came later that we, did anybody say, I think that what you're doing is wrong and we're going to put a stop to this legally?
The only reason that this stopped is because the very last lobotomy patient that Dr. Freeman had died. That was also the very last time the lobotomy procedure was legally performed in the United States.
That was a woman that was having her third lobotomy. Yeah.
She was Freeman's last patient, and she was America's last patient. Now, she was by far not the first to die or to have a really negative set of outcomes, but she was the last straw, I guess is the way you would say it. And the thing about lobotomy, this is the thing that really blew my mind. Okay, so it's one thing to go, these people are so deeply depressed or hallucinating or whatever. Let's cut the connections between the frontal lobe and the rest of the brain to see if we can't help them. But there was a case, and this was in Oklahoma City, and this would have been, oh my gosh, like back in the early 1950s. They decided to see if lobotomy could be a cure for ulcerative colitis, which is a disease of the intestine that causes severe diarrhea. So at the University of Oklahoma School of Medicine, starting in 1950, going through maybe 1954, I want to say, 5 different patients were given lobotomies to treat their ulcerative colitis. 3 men and 2 women. Both men died within a year after the lobotomy procedure. And here was the other thing. They didn't follow the patients. So we don't even know what happened to the 3 women who were given lobotomies for their ulcerative colitis. So you have to say to yourself, we have a tendency in America to romanticize the past and be so nostalgic for the better days that are behind us. But you really have to ask yourself, where were the adults in charge? Because even though we didn't know very much about the brain in 1950 when this happened, we did know that the brain and the rectum were separated from each other by quite a good distance. And it's hard for me to believe that you could look at a person suffering with ulcerative colitis and think that poking an ice pick into their eye socket would be in any way helpful. So I'll ask you the question, Max. Can you see a path for your own self to go, yeah, these folks have really painful chronic diarrhea. Maybe a lobotomy?
I think what's sad is you're taking people who are in situations that are desperate, no matter what it was that they were bringing to them. And they were going to try to do this as a last resort. And he played upon that, and he understood that. And he was such a bombastic character. I mean, and he was really more about the show than he was about the helping of people. And I suppose what was thought at the time was, well, perhaps with the case with Rose Kennedy, perhaps what they thought was, well, this is the desperate thing we're going to try. And of course, it didn't. It absolutely incapacitated her. But the thought was, but this was our last resort, and, this was our Hail Mary pass, and so we'll accept the fact that it didn't work. Do you see? I think that a lot of people were in that situation, and perhaps that's how he got away with it.
I do see that. And I think that the Rosemary Kennedy example is one of the more shameful cases of Freeman's lobotomy, because Rosemary Kennedy, whatever was going on with her, it in no way called for an intervention that extreme. She was she was literate. She was going to school. She had friends. She had definitely had developmental delays as a direct result of oxygen deprivation to her brain. Remember when her mother was in labor? Right. Keep your legs closed, shoving the baby back into the birth canal. Like, sometimes you look back at the people of the past and you go, I know that you don't know some of the things we know now, but did you know nothing? Did you absolutely have not one lick of sense? Babies need to breathe, and shoving an infant back into a woman's vaginal canal seems very much opposed to the idea of let the baby breathe. Okay, granted, people didn't know what they were doing, but the Kennedy parents chose a lobotomy for their daughter when almost anything else would have been a better intervention. She didn't need that. They destroyed her. They ruined her life. They essentially killed her with that procedure. And for what? Because her personality, her affect was not in keeping with what Joseph Kennedy envisioned for his dynasty. It's so disgusting. It's so disgusting. And the thing that really pisses me off about the Kennedy parents in this instance is Rosemary Kennedy was one of Freeman's early lobotomy patients. And you know what he learned from that? Nothing. There were no consequences to what happened to that beautiful young woman. No consequences. If the Kennedy parents had blown the whistle, we probably would have told a different story in this episode. It's infuriating, isn't it?
Because they had enough clout that if they would have said, look, this is not a procedure that should be done, they could have prevented a lot of these. They could have prevented deaths from people. But it really was how it all looked. That was really the most important thing, and we don't want anybody who is viewed as defective in the family.
That is, I don't know if it's because I'm, so, as the product of a chaotic family that the neighbors were always talking about, that'll happen when daddy's being perp walked on the Action News. I have such a chip on my shoulder in the opposite direction. And it goes like this. Oh, I'm sorry. Do I not meet appearances? Let me escalate that for you. So I've never had any patience or respect for people that would rather protect how things look than address how things really are. And in the case of Rosemary Kennedy, the issue was appearances. Now, and that's why I included her biographer in the episode. Because hating the Kennedys is like, a popular American pastime. But the truth is, we're all flawed. We're all humans, and politicians are extra flawed because of the nature of the game. But every one of Rosemary Kennedy's siblings did something to improve circumstances for people with disabilities in this country. Yeah. You have to give them that as much as you hate them. Some of y'all hate them. Well, I'm over here not being any kind of a fan because of what they did to Rosemary, what they allowed, but some good did come of that tragedy.
And if there is, that was the one thing that I was listening back to it again, and I thought to myself, because you had the Americans with Disabilities Act that was passed, and then all kinds of other charitable work that was done for people who generally are marginalized, and people who were warehoused in a lot of cases, just kind of all kinds of people warehoused together because let's just get them out of society. Let's not really deal with what the problem is, because nobody wants to talk about things like mental illness. People don't like talking about that sort of thing. It makes them uncomfortable. So let's just act like it's not happening.
Even today, that's true.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, we want to think, oh, well, we're better now. We've made all these strides. And we have made many strides, but we're nowhere near where we like to tell ourselves we are, right? Like we tell ourselves, that we're so much more evolved and advanced than we are. This chapter in American medical history, and really in American history, full stop. This is a shocking and tragic chapter, because the people that were receiving these procedures very often they had, like in the case of the 5 people in Oklahoma, they had a medical diagnosis. And yes, the body-brain connection, but if you have Crohn's disease, a lobotomy is not the way to go, right? If you have kidney disease, a lobotomy is not the way to go. And there's something in the American psyche where we just love a miracle cure, and we're so vulnerable to a flim-flam man.
Snake oil.
Yeah, there's something about us. And I think the thing that makes us so vulnerable is part of what makes us good. And that is our open-hearted, almost childlike curiosity and optimism. There are dark sides to that sort of childlike thinking that a hero will come or an expert will appear. And because it makes us vulnerable to guys like Walter Freeman, miracle cures, snake oil, the quick fix, the flim-flam. There's just something really deeply rooted in us that makes us an easy mark for that. Because if you look at what Freeman did, he not only had the American public snowed and the press, but also others in the medical establishment. I mean, he had help.
In George Washington University, where a lot of this took place, is a very respected university in Washington, D.C. But I thought that it was interesting. Dr. Watts, who was his partner, I think that he got a sense that this was out of control, And the most haunting thing in this episode was that Dr. Freeman, I guess they had agreed that Dr. Freeman wasn't going to do these anymore in that office. And he comes in one day to see a patient lying on the table with the thing stuck in the eye socket.
Yeah.
And Freeman said to him, "Oh, I'm so glad you're here. Listen, I need for you to take a picture." What? And that was it for Dr. Watts. So you said, where are the adults? Maybe Dr. Watts was the adult at some point along the line, because I guess he could see this for what it was.
Well, he was a medical doctor. Not that a neurologist isn't, but Watts had surgical training, and it was just a different. It was a completely different set of ethics, I think, that drove Watts as compared to Freeman. And you're right, George Washington University Hospital, these are acclaimed institutions. And it's unfortunate that sometimes the way that we learn best what is appropriate or effective is by doing the things that are inappropriate and downright unethical, which is what happened here. They learned the hard way that you can't go into the human brain and mess it about like this. And something that I thought about re-listening to this episode, in addition to, oh my God, slow down, stop talking so fast. So I want to, I'll come back to that. Remind me to come back to the talking too fast thing, because there's a reason for that. There's a reason that Max and I have had such a learning curve with this podcast. So we go too far. We get an idea and we're so excited that it could be this breakthrough, this miracle, and we take it way too far. Think about how different this story might be if they had drawn the line at certain mental health symptoms or diagnoses might be appropriate for transorbital lobotomy. right? Let's do a careful, controlled study of those circumstances, and let's follow and measure outcomes. That would just be good basic science. But instead, they had a little bit of success here and a little bit of success there, and before you know it, they're treating grief and anxiety and shyness with lobotomies. So we just go too far. But when you pull back from this whole episode, step back and listen to the whole story and all of the people involved, and you will see a righteous, karmic correction for everyone in this.
That is true.
So the Muniz, the Nobel Prize winning doctor who basically invented the concept of lobotomy. He called it a leucotomy because he was going after just this white and gray matter versus frontal lobes. Lobotomy, lobes, leucotomy, this other thing.
Right. So
he did win the Nobel Prize, but it's a shameful Nobel, that has been reconsidered. And the guy was basically, he died in agony when a former patient shot him, and he ended up wheelchair bound. He didn't go out in blaze of glory. But then you could argue that whatever Joseph Kennedy's sins were, they all were paid. The price for them was all paid by his children, unless you get all Shakespearean and go, yes, but a father's grief, and he knew that his children were paying for his sins. I mean, it does get real Shakespearean up in here. Nobody had a happy ending.
No, I don't think Joseph Kennedy had a happy ending. If I'm not mistaken, I think he suffered from dementia.
Yeah, which in some ways is a blessing, though, because wasn't it better for him to leave this world thinking that the mashed potatoes could talk than reflecting on the many, many things that he had done and the many choices he had made?
He had made many, many poor choices, that's for sure.
Yeah, maybe dementia was a blessing.
The fellow Howard Dully, the guy who they had performed that was haunting because we can sit here and talk about patients, but when you actually hear one speak, and when he goes through talking about the process of what happened and then how it affected him, and he's talking to you about it in that sort of flat tone, it's haunting.
I mean, this was a little boy. That they did this to, and electroshock therapy and lobotomy. And here's the thing about a procedure like the lobotomy, and we're, there are not very many of these people who've had this procedure left alive at this point, of course. When we go into your brain with an ice pick or a little metal spatula or a wire with a loop on it, and we begin sweeping, those were the words that the doctors used, when we begin sweeping that instrument around inside your head, just willy-nilly severing connections and taking tissue out, you don't get better from that. That's permanent. That's forever. And they did this to Howard Dully when he was a child. And so you just have to go, I'm sorry. When did somebody discover ethics? Like, isn't the Hippocratic Oath from Hippocrates back in ancient Greece, first do no harm? Did you folks not read it? Like, what were people thinking?
Well, and then Dr. Freeman, he didn't wash his hands before the procedure because he didn't believe in all that germ crap.
This guy, right?
We knew about all that germ crap. By that point, when he's doing this, 1940s, 1950s, they knew what that was. They knew that you needed to scrub up before you did any kind of a surgical procedure. I mean, that alone is so irresponsible, reckless, barbaric.
And you don't want to be like constantly leaping to the conclusion that these people were sadistic or sociopathic. But let me just ask you, this guy, his favorite thing to do would be a mass demonstration where he might give 40 people a lobotomy in an afternoon. What about that doesn't strike you as kind of sociopathic? Not washing. He's going from one skull to the next with no regard. And in the episode, as you heard, a patient goes down, get them out of the way. Next. Well, hello? Come on.
It took on a circus-like atmosphere that this guy, and his magic trick is this. And then he has the flamboyant clothes, the flamboyant affect with the walking stick, and all of those other things that he had. The ring that was around his neck and how he came about that.
Yeah.
I mean, all of those things sort of speak to what kind of person he was. And the fact that he ran amok the way that he did for this long, I mean, however many years, I mean, the last one was 67, I think, 1967, you said the last one was. When you think that he did this for decades and got away with it, it is astonishing. It really is.
A handy thing that I like to do, because time is hard for humans, like deep time is impossible. When I talk to you about time spans of millions or we'll say hundreds of thousands of years, we won't even get into millions. Like our brains aren't really built to comprehend it. But if you're a person that was born in, like, let's say 1984, 1954, it's just fuzzy around the edges and black and white for you, right?
Right.
So one way that when we're dealing with time, I like to think, okay, who do I know that was alive then? Well, certainly your mom and dad. Okay.
Right.
They were most certainly alive and thriving in the 50s. My grandparents, my mom would have been in 1950. How old would my mom have been? She would have been a kid still in school, but my mom was alive while this crap was going down.
Right.
And so sometimes I think we do have to play little tricks to make ourselves realize, oh, this just happened.
It did. I mean, my parents were in their, so this was the 40s. They were probably 20s, 20s, 30s, 40s. I mean, that's how old they were when all of this stuff was going down. So when you think about it in terms of that, it really was not all that long ago.
No, and by the way, your mom and dad would have read about it in their newspapers.
Oh, I'm sure.
And magazines like the Saturday Evening Post. This was the least difficult thing in the world to find are gushing, enthusiastic stories about the magical lobotomy. They're everywhere.
I can remember as a kid growing up, people would say, they'd go, I'd rather have a bottle in front of me than a frontal lobotomy, and we'd all laugh. But I had no idea. I had no idea what it was. I knew that it had something to do with the brain or with some kind of surgical procedure, but I had no idea what it was when I heard about it. And when you would hear it mentioned from time to time, it was mentioned in a way that was negative, like this is something that shouldn't have been done. But I never had any idea how reckless this guy was and the amount of them that were done. And I also knew in growing up that one of the Kennedy children had something wrong with her and she lived in an institution. I knew that. But as far as what happened to her, that this is really what caused that, I had no idea.
Well, the Kennedys were very good at public relations because everybody sort of knew that there was a daughter who was somewhere. And you would hear different things about, well, she's mentally ill or there's something wrong with her from birth. But I don't know that it was widely understood that she was the victim of an insanely botched, batshit medical procedure. Well, I don't think that was widely known at the time. It is now. Mm-hmm. But I don't think it was widely known at the time when she disappeared from public view and was like the family secret.
Well, I mean, I think that times were different. That's one thing. And so I think that when bad things happen, we hid them. I'm not saying that justifies what they did, but I'm saying that
No.
that was common practice with all kinds of things. Oh, hell, you can see that with what the Catholic Church did with Roman Catholic priests that were abusing children. What would they do? Well, they'd hide it. They would say, "Look, this you shouldn't have been doing this, but we'll discipline them. This isn't a legal matter. This is our matter, and we'll move them somewhere else." So that was the idea with all kinds of things that were happening. School teachers, the same thing. Teachers would pop up at one school and they would do something there, and they would end up at another school somewhere because I guess, you didn't have the way to check a lot of that stuff at that time. But I also think that there was the idea of we don't want things to look inappropriate.
Well, and the culture was different too. Like the press conspired to keep certain secrets.
Oh,
like
yeah.
Now we're in a weird moment now, but broadly speaking now, the media can't wait to tell you a salacious secret about a public figure or a politician, right? But back then, and we really saw this in the JFK White House, the Camelot years, they all knew that JFK was a cheating, horny dog.
But it was like a gentleman's agreement. It was like a gentleman's agreement that, okay, fine, you're doing this, but we're not going to reveal it because we're not going to reveal it.
And the same was true. The culture back then, what you said is what really resonated with me about how people kept difficult family things private. It was understood that that was a family matter. I think that although the public didn't know what was going on with Rosemary Kennedy, a lot of people, including in the press, did.
Sure they did.
But it was considered, well, that's a family matter. She's not a public figure. We shouldn't in any way make life difficult for her. And Rose Kennedy, her mother, was also not a politician or tycoon or public figure, and it's a mother's grief. So you could say that sort of culture of protection back then, you could argue, I think, that those were better days. Those were better days. We are not entitled to know what public figures ate for breakfast or what their biggest embarrassing moment was. We really aren't entitled to know that. What we're entitled to is when public figures in a position of the public trust do something to betray that trust.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think to go back to how much they could have stepped up and said, this didn't work, this needs to stop. But I guess they didn't want to admit that that's what they did. They didn't want to admit that they had a daughter that they felt they needed to do this with. I don't know.
I think it's a lot of that. And we all got choices. Like sometimes you're making a choice a minute that can dramatically change the course of your life. So I want you to think about how different the world would be if the Kennedy parents had come forward and put a stop to this. They would have been the heroes of this story instead of one of the villains.
Mm-hmm.
And the downstream effect of blowing the whistle and putting a stop to this bizarre period of just fishing around in people's brains, sometimes for an audience, for entertainment purposes. They could have ended that. And they didn't. And I think they made a selfish decision to protect their quote unquote reputation, their family honor or whatever, that betrayed humanity and their daughter. I don't think it's too strong to say that. I think it was a betrayal at a very high level.
But I do think that I guess they did. If I remember the story correctly, the people from George Washington did reprimand him at some point along the line for some way that he was handling some of this. I mean, it did happen there, but at some point along the line, they did, if I remember the story correctly, they did say, Dr. Freeman, you need to not be doing this anymore.
Well, they certainly banned him from doing the procedure there.
Yeah.
which I guess was the limit of their power, right? Like they were only empowered to decide who could or couldn't practice medicine there. So yeah, there were people that forcefully stood up. His partner, his former partner.
Dr. Watts.
Yeah. It's just, it's insane to me that this happened in the magnitude that it did. This isn't like, well, a handful of people and they had a terrible outcome and oops. This was
Well, the fact that he was killing people. I mean, there were people that died from this. But of course they did. You're in there and you don't really, you sort of kind of know where you're going. When I think about when I have had back problems and I've gotten injections in my back, they have a way that they can see where they're putting the needle.
Yeah.
I'm really glad because it's my spinal cord and it's really important to me that nothing bad happens to that. But they're able to see where they're going in with that, and they're able to look at that stuff. There was no mechanism for that
None
back
of that.
then.
They were literally just shooting in the dark. That's all they were doing. They were guessing. And the guesswork was really extra big and bad because not only could they not see the brain that they were lobotomizing, but before they went in with the ice pick, they were real unclear as to what parts of the brain might do what. So we had ignorance compounded on top of ignorance, using people as guinea pigs. And part of the reason that they did successfully get away with so much of this for so long has everything to do with how we think of people with mental health disorders in American culture. We no longer use the word defective, although I think there are people out there that still think it. But we no longer, the word defective was a medical term. Which episode of this podcast was it where we broke down the different definitions of moron, imbecile? Was it Asylum Ladies? It might have been.
I think that's the one, because those were justifications for putting these women in institutions.
Yeah, they were considered legitimate diagnoses. So it's the way we think about the people that received these treatments with Freeman and these other doctors who were doing, DIY lobotomies. In American culture, those people, they were not worth as much as you. We valued them as lesser human beings. And the greatest proof of that can be seen in the way these old state hospitals, which were constructed to be lunatic asylums, that's what they were first called. And then they were, they would get other names like mental health asylums or hospitals or whatever. So many of them have so many unmarked graves on the grounds. You can tell a lot about a civilization by the way they treat their dead. And we've been pretty astounded in recent years to discover early human cousins, not Homo sapiens, but other hominids, that like 23,000 years ago were treating their dead with reverence, burying them with tokens and objects and flowers and with reverence, right? Treating the dead with reverence. That's one of the hallmarks of civilization. So what does it say about us that in the 1900s, 30s, 40s, 50s, right up until the 70s at the Reform School, the Florida School for Boys, we did the episode on.
Yeah.
We decide certain human beings are deserving of less than others. And people in this country with mental health diagnoses have almost always consistently been accorded less value. We have seen it over and over again. And that's because there is such a strong eugenics thread that runs throughout our history. This idea that some people are more fit to breed than others. And by the way, it never goes away It never goes
No.
away, but it changes its masks and it rears itself up in different ways. Like right now, these people on the internet that are banging the drum about replacement theory, oh, the white race is being replaced. That's eugenics, because what they're, even though they don't use that word, and many of them, I'm sorry, y'all don't even know the word, but here's what they're saying. They're saying eugenics is basically, in a nutshell, who is fit to reproduce.
Mm-hmm.
And replacement theory is saying white people are fit to reproduce, more fit than anything else. So it never goes away. It's a through line in this country since our earliest days. And you see it play out in every generation. It puts on a new mask and takes a new form. And we see it all the time on True Weird Stuff. You know, we saw the eugenics rear its ugly head in the New Jersey Pine Barrens.
Right. That's right. The asylum ladies. The other one was, I was thinking about the juvenile detention camp that was down in Florida. I remember when you started talking about that with the graves, I went, oh yes, we've broached this subject a few times.
This is what we do. You know, this is what we do. And until I think we're a little bit like, I think as a nation, as a people, we're a little bit like the people in this story, Ice Pick to the Brain. We're acting and we're in the moment. And what we're not realizing are the historical and karmic forces that are waiting to pounce. As they always
seem to in these stories.
So this episode was early on in the life of True Weird Stuff, and we would do it very differently. But Max and I were talking last night. We would do this very differently today.
We would have Don Morgan doing the voice of Dr. Freeman.
Oh, I would have. Oh, Don Morgan. Doc, our other producer, said, you should rewrite this and put it in the characters' voices. Oh, Don Morgan would make a hell of a Dr. Freeman. So when we first started this podcast, we had the idea and we had the passion, and we thought, well, we're not really sure. We're going to let it tell us what it is as we go. But our day jobs are radio, and in radio, everything moves really fast. Right. No dead air, chop, 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 just get to it. Because people have, a lot of distractions, and we all have short attention spans. So listening to this episode, I know we were both screaming, slow down.
Well, yeah, go ahead, Sherry.
And we also, as with every episode, we would be like, well, what if we did it this way? Well, what if we tried it that way? On everything from the writing to the casting to the production to the music. And I remember this episode when we were working on it, I was like, Max, I have an idea. I don't know if it'll work. What if they're talking about Rosemary Kennedy singing while they performed the lobotomy, and they didn't know they had ruined her. They didn't know they went too far until she fell silent. Would it be too much? Would it be too melodramatic to build that into the episode? And Max was like, it's worth a try. And so this is one of the first episodes where we kind of took a shot at telling the story in a different way. And Elizabeth Jordan, who sang as Rosemary, blew our minds. She was so good.
Well, to go back to what you were talking about with working in radio, between voicing it and then producing it, we do everything in a way that if you're listening to the radio, you don't hear any pauses. Because if there's pauses, that means something's wrong. And so the noise that's coming out of the radio is constant. When you do this, you have to have some pauses at some points along the line, and it's a better way of telling the story. You want the story to move, obviously. You don't want it to become boring. But at the same time, when I was listening to what I did with Elizabeth and the Rosemary Kennedy thing, I went, I would have done this differently. I would do this differently now. So, we've learned as we've gone along. We knew when we started that we would learn. We went, okay, fine. This is what we know we can do at this point. And as we went along, we both have learned an awful lot by it. And we appreciate you coming along for the ride as we learn what we're doing with this podcast.
And I think, I love how the people who listen are true weirdos, the tweirdos, as someone called themselves in a live happy hour that we did, that they've been so open to the experimentation, because we had to, we had to figure some stuff out, and we didn't know what we could do because we have no resources. Like, we have no budget. We have no time. We've only got us and Doc and, Heather and Tony and Steven. And most of it comes down to you and me. Right. Yeah. And so we started asking people, hey, would you be willing to voice a couple of lines in an episode of this? And to our shock and amazement, the people that we asked were like, yeah. And then they did it, and they were like, that was fun. I'll do that again if you want. And then, of course, I met my muse, Don Morgan, and the rest is history. So, yeah, we didn't know that. Aren't you glad that we didn't know that? Isn't it better to sort of learn and have it tell you what it's going to be?
It is, yeah. And so I think that we learned how to tell the story in a more effective way when we started doing that.
And it freed us up too. Okay, one of the things that, and I still do this, I'm still really committed to doing this. I write with an invisible skeptic and debunker sitting next to me who's like, no, that didn't happen. And so I'm like, oh, yes, it did. Let me prove to you that it happened. So I'm really nerded out on the facts of it and the research of it. And that hasn't changed. But what we did, we gave ourselves permission to open the story up and allow for, because we're not doing a documentary here, right? We're telling a story. We opened the story up, and both in terms of the writing and the sound and production, we allowed ourselves more room to be playful. Mm-hmm. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And not worry and trust that, okay, we tried it with this one. Now we'll go a little bit farther with the next one. We'll try to do something a little bit different. But I think the one thing that I love about the writing, the way you approach it, is they're all different. They all have, there's a consistency of storytelling, obviously, but you go about it in different ways at different times. And that's the thing that I love about it, because it's fun to produce it that way, because each week is a challenge. Now some weeks, the challenge, I'm going, I don't have enough time for this, because we have our full-time jobs. I know you might be thinking, but I only hear you for so many hours on the radio or with the podcast, but the jobs are demanding. That's not a complaint, because we love what we do, but they are demanding, and you only have so many hours, and you're always trying to make sure that you have the balance of being able to have the rest of your life on the outside as well. So,
which, I feel guilty all the time, and for me, it's not really work. When you have something in your life that you do, whether it's like part of your job or a hobby or whatever, and you look up and 4 hours have gone by, that's what researching stuff and writing is like for me. And it's really not fair to my husband and family, because if I'm not working my day job, if I'm not doing the radio thing, I'm almost always working on this, which for me doesn't feel like work. But I'm trying to get more efficient about it so that I, can be more present in my life. We had said when we started off with True Weird Stuff, we're going to give it 2 full years before we even evaluate, because we have no backing. We're not part of Wondery or iHeart or any of the Amazon, any of these big networks that can put your podcast on the map. We're like Magellan, we're putting it on the map.
Yes, that's right.
And so we decided that we would, other than the critical voices in our heads that always tell us how we suck, that we would not like really evaluate growth or performance or anything until we've done it for 2 solid years. And I'm happy to say that we still don't have any big network behind us, but we've won a Signal Award. We've won a Women in Podcasting Award. We've won a 50 over 50 award. We're nominated for a Webby, and it gets no better than that. I mean, that's the peak. A Webby is the peak for this. So, I guess we can take a peek at evaluating a little bit ahead of schedule and say we still have no resources.
we don't.
But we have people. We have our people. We have our weirdo community.
Thank God we have, Sherry, thank God we have people that are willing to work for free as well on this. So, I mean, because we're not making money on it. We're really not.
Oh God, no. Oh no, we're losing. Shh, I don't like to say that out loud because I don't like to remind
Tony
Garcia that we're actually losing money on this. But it's been, oh my gosh, it's just been such a labor of love. And Doc once, our other producer, the equally odd Carrie Bowser that you hear in the credits, Doc would like us to go back and put postmortems on the early episodes that didn't have it, and rewrite and add voices to some of the other episodes. And we'll try. We'll try.
Thank you, Doc.
I want to tell you why we didn't put postmortem chats on the first wave of episodes, because we kept being told that nobody wanted to listen to a podcast that was more than maybe 7 to 11 minutes long. And so we tried. I mean, we never tried to be 7 minutes long. You can't tell a story with any dimension in 7 minutes. I mean, I know Baby Shoes for Sale Never Worn. I know Hemingway did it, but how are we telling this lobotomy story in 7 minutes? How are we telling it in 11 minutes? And also my hyperfixation, info dumping, bad self just was like, tell you what, we're not asking you to pay us for this. Max and I are going to do what we want to do. How's that?
That's right. That's kind of how I felt about it. Well, I wasn't sure when we started doing the postmortems. I went, well, this is fun. And I like talking to you about it because it's kind of like what we do anyhow, just in conversation about things. And I thought, I don't know if people want to listen to it. Maybe they'll listen to the produced part, but I don't know if they want to listen to this. And time and time again, we've gotten notes that have said, our favorite part is that you're discussing it afterwards.
My brother Mark told me, he was like, I love early on. I didn't even tell, I don't even tell my family that I do these things because then they feel like, oh, now we have to support it. And then they don't really want to. And then I find out they haven't really listened. And then my feelings are hurt. Now it's Christmas. So I just didn't tell. I didn't make a big deal out of, well, we're doing this podcast, Max and I. My brother found it and tells me after we added the postmortem, yeah, I listen to True Word Stuff every week. I really like it. I like it better now that you and Max added the postmortem chat, which you and I thought, well, 3 people might listen to that. But what ends up happening is, as much detail as we put into these stories, there's always stuff that you have to cut for time. It's not in the episode that they were treating people with ulcerative colitis with lobotomy in Oklahoma, because now I'm down another rabbit hole and I've done another tangent, and I have enough rabbit holes and tangents in these episodes as it is. So yeah, we're able to include stuff in the after chat. And this is the first time, by the way, that we've added a postmortem to one of the early episodes.
Right. Which is
why we're
Doc's idea.
Doc's idea. Which is why we're kind of all over the map, because we haven't had a chance to do this. And what a cringe fest listening and being so mad at ourselves at all the ways we could have done a better job with this story. What a punishment that's been. But it's good. The Buddha says that being humbled burnishes the soul and whatnot. So here we are getting our souls burnished.
But do I have to have it this much, Sherry? I mean, you know.
That's why when Doc said, he gave us a list of episodes we should add postmortem chats to. And I know your heart sank too.
Because I've got to re-listen to it.
So the good news is that lobotomy is illegal in the United States and has been since that terrible day in 1967 when Freeman's last lobotomy patient died. So that's the good news, right? We can be a little bit happy about that. And it's also almost unheard of anywhere else in the world to give people lobotomy. Which, does that surprise you? Because you know, we have all these expressions about lobotomy in pop culture, and it's just this shameful chapter now that's closed.
Yeah. It makes me wonder if there's something that's going on now that you could do a podcast about it 40 years that's happening now. And people go, that's horrifying. They're doing this now. So something somewhere that's being done that's like a procedure like this.
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure.
Sadly.
I don't. And well, that's the other challenge with this. So like, we'll be working on an episode and then news will break and we could pull that new information in. But now, you know, it's like a 3-part miniseries. So what I try to do with something like that is I make a note and think, all right, well, we'll come back and tell this version of that story through a different lens. Like everything that we're discovering now about what is happening under the pyramids of Egypt or not, you know, we're still waiting on proof. What's happening underneath Antarctica. All of that is sort of like breaking news that figures into previous or upcoming episodes. So we do try. I think we've kind of landed on a standard length at this point. That's longer than 7 minutes, but not 6 hours.
And we're forever grateful that you listen to this kooky little podcast. We really are.
So grateful. It's so much fun. Even the horrific stories are so fun to tell because when we tell them, then that's one more person who knows that this bad thing happened. One more person that'll be sensitized if they see this bad thing happening again. And that's like, you know, that's for a story like this. But then there are all these people that were forgotten and we say their names again and we bring them back into living memory. Like Elmer McCurdy, the star of the episode called A Real Stiff, or Daisy Dell Simpson, the lady hooch hunter, you know, are all of these people that were pretty awesome and pretty cool. And either had an utterly a wild, amazing life or an utterly unbelievably tragic life. Like it's fun to bring their names back into the world and tell their stories again.
It is. Yeah. In fact, that's one of my favorite episodes. I love that story about the lady hooch hunter.
Oh, I love Daisy Dell
and
Simpson.
how you came upon it, which was another great story. So anyhow.
Just love her. So on the next True Weird Stuff, we're going to tell you the story of a man who appeared to everyone's shock and amazement to testify at his own murder trial. That doesn't happen every day.
Nope.
And that's another one of these great American stories, one of these great American stories that's just kind of disappeared because there's so many things happening every minute of every day. You can't keep track of all of it.
Yeah.
So that's coming up for you on the next episode of True Weird Stuff. And if you've been here from the beginning, thank you. Boy, have you suffered.
Sherry, we're just too critical of ourselves, I think. Listening to it, I was horrified at certain things from a production standpoint. And then I thought to myself, most people listening, it's just going to go, you know. So.
I popped my earbuds in and headed for a walk to re-listen to the episode. I'm surprised nobody didn't call 911 because at one point I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk and yelled, "Slow down!" I was so mad at myself.
Well, I'm driving. I'm driving on the road. And I go, there's an abutment. There we go.
Yeah, like yank this car off the bridge. You know what, Max? We're just going to have to commit to trying even harder to not suck so much. What do you think?
There you go.
Pinky swear right now.
Right now. All right. Pinky's out. There we go. There we
go. Thank you, True Weirdos, for being here from the beginning. And if you can vote, there's a People's Voice Award component to the Webby nomination. So the Webbies, you're nominated by the judges, some panel of judges, listen to all these things and then declare the nominees. There are 5 nominees in each category. So we're nominated for individual episode, podcast, history category, along with 4 other shows, including The Side Door by the Smithsonian. So the competition is very tough indeed.
Which is a podcast that I listened to. When I said that, when I saw that, I went, man, we're almost legitimate. And I think so I know some of you don't listen to this real time, but if you want to vote for this, we have a link up on our website. It's on our Facebook page. Correct, Sherry? I know it's on the Facebook page. The link right to it, you can, and the voting is up on April 17th, 2025. So I don't know when you're listening to this, but if you're listening to this, as it's dropped or sometime before the 17th, please vote. It really would help us.
And I have to tell y'all, just the nomination, when we got the news, we were working when we got the news. And I said to Max and Doc, hang on, because I started to cry. I'm like, hang on. This little podcast that's more than 11 minutes that everybody's working for free on, all of our voice actors, everybody, Doc, Max, Heather, everybody's working for free. This little podcast got a Webby nomination for being one of the 5 best in the world in its category.
It's a deal. It really is.
Just going to hyperventilate.
We're going
of course, we didn't get it. We didn't get it last year because we were talking too fast and making poor choices with some of our.
And you should listen to Side Door, but just don't vote for them, okay?
Yeah, it's a really good show. Our fellow nominees in that category include another great show, The Bowery Boys. Like, it's so fun to see your little goofy show next to the Smithsonian. It's kind of really amazing.
And there's another one. There's another one that's from the American Jewish Historical Society, and I know we're up against it, but I have not had a chance to listen to that episode either. And so
I'm really excited, and I'm so thankful for it, because now, I can, when Max is working 18 hours a day, I can be like, yeah, but hey, buddy. Hey, buddy, I know you can't pay rent with these award nominations and awards, but it ain't nothing.
We are rich in spirit, Sherry. And so we're going to do the updated credits here for this. I know there were credits at the end of the produced part, but we're going to do the updated credits coming out here too. So just warn
for
you
2025.
Yeah. And if you listen to us on Apple Podcast, hit the plus button in the top right corner, and now it helps an independent podcast like ours to get discovered. And we really appreciate it if you subscribe, rate, and review True Weird Stuff.
Hit our website, trueweirdstuff.com, for show notes and photos and videos when we have it, and bonus content. Everything True Weird is waiting for you at trueweirdstuff.com.
And follow True Weird Stuff on Instagram.
True Weird Stuff is a Now Media production. Our executive producer is Anthony Garcia. The show is written and hosted by me, Sherry Lynch, along with my deeply weird director, Max Sweeten. Our equally odd producer is Carrie Bowser. Additional production by the mysterious Stephen Call. Our digital witch and social media cult leader is Heather Furr. Original graphics by Kevin Nash. Original artworks by Olivia Axlin. True Weird original music composed and performed by Jack Griffin and Zane Nash. Copyright 2025 Now Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs remembered.